All right, today we're diving into something truly fascinating. It's a discovery that basically reopens a decades-old cold case right at the heart of Alzheimer's research.
You know, for years, scientists have been on this relentless hunt for the cause of the most common form of Alzheimer's. But what if the prime suspect was let go way too early, with what seemed like a perfect alibi?
See, there's this one particular gene that's always been at the scene of the crime, so to speak. But for almost everyone with the disease, we're talking 95% of patients, this gene looked totally innocent.
Well, guess what? That alibi just completely crumbled. Thanks to a totally new way of understanding our own DNA, this old case has been blown wide open. And what they found? It's pretty stunning.
Okay, so to really get why this is such a huge deal, we need to rewind. Let's go back to the original mystery that had researchers scratching their heads for so long. We're talking about the 95% mystery.
So you gotta understand, Alzheimer's isn't just one thing. It kind of comes in two flavors. First, you've got the rare familial type. That's less than 5% of all cases. It's clearly genetic. If you inherit certain gene mutations, you get the disease. Simple as that. But then, there's the other 95%. This is called sporadic Alzheimer's. And for these folks, the cause has been a complete black box, a total mystery.
Now, in any good mystery, you've got a prime suspect, right? And here, it has always been a gene called APP. This gene basically holds the recipe for the protein that gums up the works and forms those sticky amyloid plaques in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. We know for a fact that this gene is the culprit in the rare familial form. I mean, look at people with Down syndrome. They have a third copy of the chromosome where the APP gene lives, and they almost always develop the brain changes tied to Alzheimer's. So yeah, APP was suspect number one, for sure.
But, and this is a huge but, here's the twist. Back in the 80s, when scientists went looking for extra copies of this gene in patients with that common sporadic form of Alzheimer's, they came up empty. Nothing. They tested blood, they even tested chunks of brain tissue, and the results were always the same. No extra APP gene. The suspect had a rock-solid alibi. And just like that, the case went cold.
And that case stayed cold for decades. Why? Well, it's all because of a fundamental assumption, something we all probably learned in high school biology, an assumption that, as it turns out, isn't the whole story.
Yeah, we were all taught that every single cell in your body contains the exact same DNA blueprint. But it's not quite that simple. We now know that's not exactly true. Especially in a place as complex as the brain, our cells can actually have slightly different DNA from each other. This wild idea is called genomic mosaicism. Our bodies aren't a perfect monolith. They're more like a patchwork quilt of slightly different genetic codes.
So forget that old textbook picture of a perfectly uniform set of cells. The new reality is much more interesting. A small fraction of our cells can actually have a different genetic makeup. And as we're about to see, that small fraction, well, it can make all the difference.
Right, so this new idea, this concept that our brains are a genetic mosaic, it sparked a huge light bulb moment for scientists. They started thinking, wait a minute, what if the culprit wasn't in every cell? What if it was just hiding out in a few of them? It was time to pull out that old evidence and look again, but with brand new eyes.
See, the big problem with those original studies from the 80s was how they looked at the evidence. They were analyzing bulk tissue, basically grinding up millions of cells all at once. Now think about it. If only a handful of those millions of cells had the extra genes, that signal would be totally washed out, just averaged into nothing. It was like trying to find one specific face by looking at a blurry photo of a giant stadio crowd.
So the new game plan was simple. Stop looking at the blurry crowd photo and start interviewing the individual witnesses. Researchers came up with these incredible techniques to pull out single brain cells one by one and analyze their DNA individually. And let me tell you, they did not mess around this time. They were super thorough, using this 5-step process to build a case that was basically airtight. They measured the total DNA, they looked at small groups of cells, then zoomed right in on single cells, they ruled out any other possible explanations, and then, the final proof, they actually saw the extra genes with their own eyes using powerful microscopes. Okay, so with this incredibly detailed, meticulous new investigation, a completely new picture started to come into focus. The researchers were finally closing in on the evidence that had been hiding in plain sight for over 30 years. I mean, can you imagine the tension? After all this time, after decades of thinking the APP gene was off the hook for 95% of cases, what did they actually find when they finally got a look at these individual neurons up close? The whole thing came down to one absolutely shocking number. Remember,
You and I were supposed to have 2 copies of that APP gene, one from mom, one from dad. But in some of these brain cells from Alzheimer's patients, they found up to 12.
Yeah, you heard that right. 12 copies. Some of these individual brain cells were just loaded with extra copies of the APP gene. The alibi was totally shattered. The culprit hadn't been missing from the scene, it was just hiding out in the brain's genetic mosaic all along.
And we're not talking about some 1 in a million fluke here. The data was crystal clear. In healthy brains, maybe about 15% of neurons show some of this variation. But in the brains of people with sporadic Alzheimer's, that number skyrocketed to 66%. That's more than a 4-fold jump in the number of cells carrying this extra genetic weight.
And you can literally see it in the raw data. It's so cool. In a healthy brain, if you plot out the DNA from thousands of cells, you get this nice, clean peak. But in an Alzheimer's brain, you see this. See that little bulge on the right? They call it the right-hand shoulder. That is the smoking gun. It's the visual proof of a hidden population of cells just packed with way more DNA than they should have.
Wow. So look, this discovery, it isn't just about closing an old case. This completely rewrites the story of Alzheimer's. It opens up a whole new chapter in the search for answers.
So what's the big takeaway here? Why does this matter so much? Well, for one, it finally gives us the first real, strong genetic link for that huge 95% of Alzheimer's cases that always seem to just happen. It also makes you wonder, right? Could this whole genetic mosaic idea be a factor in other complex brain diseases too? And of course, it gives researchers brand new targets to aim for when developing treatments. But maybe the biggest thing is it just fundamentally changes how we think about our own DNA. It's not this static, unchanging thing we're born with.
You know, it's funny. Solving one huge mystery just opens the door to a bunch of new ones. Like, when does this whole process even start? Is it something that happens as we get older? And if the APP gene can make extra copies of itself, what other secrets might be hiding inside the incredible genetic mosaic of our own brains? We found one culprit, but the investigation is really just beginning.